The Missouri Territory in the spring of 1847 was a land of broken dreams and second chances, where wagon trains carrying desperate families stretched across endless prairies like prayer beads on heaven's rosary. When the grass fires came that terrible April morning, sweeping across the plains with the fury of divine judgment, they left behind more than just charred earth and scattered belongings. They left behind a young woman named Catherine Walsh, 8 months pregnant and utterly alone, standing beside the smoking ruins of everything she had ever owned. Before we continue with Catherine's incredible journey, let me ask you, have you ever found yourself completely abandoned when you needed help the most? Catherine's story will show you that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that the bonds of sisterhood can transcend every boundary that society tries to build between us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine Elizabeth Walsh stood in the tall prairie grass, her hands pressed protectively over her swollen belly, watching the last wisps of smoke rise from what had been her wagon just hours before. The acrid smell of burned canvas and charred wood filled her nostrils, mixing with the sweet scent of spring wildflowers that should have promised new beginnings instead of devastating endings. At 23, Catherine had already buried one husband and was carrying the child of another man who had promised to marry her before their wagon train reached Oregon Territory. That man, Samuel Morrison, was nowhere to be seen now. Neither were the 37 other families who had been traveling with them when the grass fire swept across their camp like the wrath of an angry god. The fire had started before dawn, sparked by lightning from a storm that had passed through during the night. Catherine had awakened to screams and the terrifying crackle of flames consuming the dry prairie grass around their circled wagons. In the chaos that followed, with people frantically hitching teams and fleeing the advancing inferno, her own wagon had caught fire before Samuel could get their oxen properly hitched. She remembered the moment with crystalline clarity. Samuel, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the burning wagon, his face twisted with panic and something else she hadn't recognized until now. It had been calculation, the cold arithmetic of survival that weighed her pregnant condition against his own chances of escape. "Catherine, we have to leave everything," he had shouted over the roar of approaching flames. "The Hendersons said they've got room in their wagon. Run!" But when she had stumbled through the smoke toward the Henderson wagon, her pregnancy making her clumsy and slow, she found it already pulling away. Mrs. Henderson had looked back with genuine anguish in her eyes, but her husband was whipping their oxen forward, racing to stay ahead of the fire that was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Samuel had thrown her few precious belongings, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her first husband, and a small bag of coins, into a grain sack and pressed it into her hands. "I'll come back for you," he had promised, his words nearly lost in the roar of wind and flame. "I'll get help and come back." That had been 6 hours ago. The sun was now high overhead, beating down mercilessly on the blackened landscape. And Catherine knew with the bitter certainty of experience that Samuel Morrison would not be coming back. Just as her first husband's family had abandoned her when the cholera took him outside Independence, Missouri, the wagon train had cut its losses and moved on without her. She was alone on the vast prairie with nothing but the clothes on her back, a few personal items, and a baby due to arrive within the month. The nearest settlement was Fort Gibson, somewhere to the southwest, but she had no clear idea of the distance or direction. The morning's chaos had left her disoriented, and the familiar landmarks that wagon train guides used for navigation were obscured by smoke and haze. Catherine sank down onto a charred log that had once been part of someone's wagon tongue, trying to think past the fear that threatened to overwhelm her completely. She had survived her first husband's death and the rejection of his family. She had endured the shame of becoming pregnant outside of marriage and the whispered judgments of other women on the wagon train. She had even survived this morning's fire when others had not been so fortunate. But this felt different. This felt final in a way that her previous hardships had not. A pregnant woman alone on the frontier had few options, and none of them were good. She could try to walk toward Fort Gibson and hope to reach civilization before exhaustion or childbirth killed her. She could wait here and pray that another wagon train would pass this way, though the fire would have warned off any sensible travelers. Or she could simply give up, lie down in the tall grass and let nature take its course. The baby kicked sharply against her ribs, as though protesting her momentary despair. Catherine placed both hands on her belly and felt the strong, insistent movement of new life demanding to be born, demanding to live. Her child deserved better than a mother who surrendered at the first sight of impossible odds. "All right, little one," she whispered to her unborn child. "We're not giving up. We're going to figure this out." She stood up slowly, her back aching from the baby's weight, and began to take inventory of her situation with the methodical approach that had kept her alive through previous crises. The grain sack contained her mother's worn leather Bible, the daguerreotype in its protective case, 17 silver dollars, a small sewing kit, and a packet of seeds her mother had given her for planting in Oregon, tomatoes, beans, and flowers, that were supposed to make her new home beautiful. Her clothing was practical frontier wear, a sturdy wool dress that had been let out twice to accommodate her pregnancy, a cotton apron, a woolen shawl, and solid leather boots that had already walked hundreds of miles. She had a good knife on her belt, a gift from her first husband, and her mother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. The landscape around her was a study in contrasts. Where the fire had passed, the earth was black and still smoking in places, with the twisted metal remains of wagon hardware scattered like broken bones. But beyond the burn zone, the prairie stretched away in all directions, green and alive with spring growth. She could see a line of trees in the distance that probably marked a creek or river, and where there was water, there might be game or, at least, edible plants. Catherine had grown up on a small farm in Ohio before marrying her first husband and heading west. She knew something about living off the land, about which plants were safe to eat and how to find water when creeks ran dry. Her mother had been a practical woman who believed in preparing her daughters for any hardship life might bring. A woman who can't take care of herself will always be at the mercy of others, her mother had often said, and mercy isn't something you can count on finding when you need it most. The irony of those words wasn't lost on Catherine now, standing alone in the aftermath of abandonment by people she had trusted with her life. But her mother had also taught her other lessons, about edible roots and medicinal plants, about reading, weather signs and finding direction by the stars, about the kind of stubborn determination that had carried pioneer women across impossible distances. She picked up the grain sack and began walking toward the distant tree line, moving slowly to conserve her strength and avoid putting too much strain on her pregnancy. Each step was a small act of defiance against the circumstances that seemed designed to crush her, a declaration that she would not lie down and die just because other people had written her off as expendable. The sun climbed higher as she walked, and the heat began to take its toll. Her wool dress, practical for cool spring mornings, became stifling under the prairie sun. Sweat trickled down her face and back, and her feet began to ache in boots that hadn't been designed for long-distance walking on uneven ground. But she kept moving, pausing occasionally to rest and to feel for the baby's movements. The child was still active, still strong, and that gave her the courage to take the next step and the next. Behind her, the smoke from the burned wagons gradually faded into the distance. Ahead of her lay uncertainty, but also possibility. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine began to notice that she wasn't entirely alone on the prairie. Birds that had fled the fire were beginning to return, and she saw rabbits and prairie dogs emerging from their burrows to investigate the changed landscape. Life was already beginning to reclaim what the fire had taken, and there was something hopeful in that resilience. She reached the tree line just as the sun was beginning to sink, toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of better times. The trees marked a small creek, just as she had hoped, with clear water running over a bed of smooth stones. She knelt carefully at the water's edge and drank deeply, the cool liquid tasting better than wine after her long walk across the sun-baked prairie. The creek was lined with cottonwoods and willows, their new leaves creating pockets of shade that offered relief from the heat. Catherine found a fallen log that formed a natural seat and sat down to rest, letting her feet soak in the way. Cool water while she considered her next move. She had water now, and shelter of sorts. The trees would provide some protection from the elements, and she might be able to build a simple lean-to from fallen branches if she needed to stay here for any length of time. There might be fish in the creek, and she had seen signs of game along the banks, deer tracks in the mud, and the distinctive scratch marks where bears had marked territory on tree trunks. But evening was coming, and with it would come new dangers. Wolves and mountain lions hunted after dark, and a pregnant woman alone would be easy prey. She needed to find or create shelter before nightfall, and she needed to do it soon. Catherine was gathering fallen branches for a shelter when she heard the sound of approaching horses, their hoofbeats muffled by the soft earth near the creek. Her first instinct was to hide, remembering stories of raiders and hostile Indians that wagon train leaders had used to frighten travelers into compliance. But then she realized that hiding might not be possible, and besides, other people might mean rescue rather than danger. She stood up slowly, her hand resting on the knife at her belt, and waited to see who would emerge from the gathering dusk. The sound of horses grew closer, and she could hear voices now, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, but that sounded somehow familiar from half-remembered encounters at trading posts along the trail. 3 riders emerged from the trees, upstream, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't fleeing from anything or pursuing prey. In the dim light, Catherine could see that they were Indians, though she couldn't tell which tribe. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to stand still and maintain a calm demeanor that might suggest confidence rather than fear. Some riders saw her almost immediately and stopped their horses about 20 yards away. They spoke among themselves in their own language, and Catherine caught tones of surprise and concern rather than hostility. After a moment, one of them, a woman, Catherine realized with surprise, dismounted and began walking toward her. The Cherokee medicine woman approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened strangers. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair braided with beads and feathers, wearing a combination of traditional Cherokee clothing and practical frontier gear. Her face was weathered by years of outdoor living, but her dark eyes held intelligence and something that looked like compassion. When she was about 10 feet away, the woman stopped and spoke in careful English. "You are alone here?" Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "The smoke we saw today, that was your people's wagons?" Again, Catherine nodded. The Cherokee woman studied her for a long moment, taking in her obvious pregnancy, her few possessions, and the exhaustion that was beginning to show despite her efforts to appear strong. When she spoke again, her voice carried both authority and unexpected gentleness. "I am a Yana Nightbird. These are my sons, Thomas and James. We saw the great fire this morning and came to see if anyone needed help." She paused, her gaze steady and searching. "It appears that you do," The simple acknowledgement of her desperate situation broke through Catherine's carefully maintained composure. Tears she had been holding back all day began to flow, and she found herself speaking in a rush of words that tumbled over each other. In their urgency to be heard, "My name is Catherine Walsh. The fire took our wagon. And the others, they left me behind. They said they'd come back, but—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would admit her complete abandonment. Ayanna. Nightbird nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen such tragedies before. "How long until your child comes?" "A month, maybe less." The Cherokee woman exchanged glances with her sons, and Catherine caught fragments of conversation in their own language. She didn't understand the words, but the tone suggested debate or consultation about what to do with an unexpected responsibility. Finally, Ayanna stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on Catherine's shoulder. "You cannot stay here alone. The wolves will smell your fear, and there are worse things than wolves on these prairies." She paused, seeming to make a decision that surprised even her sons. "You will come with us. My village is not far, and our women know much about bringing babies safely into the world." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Catherine could hardly believe she had heard correctly. "You would do that for a stranger?" "The Great Spirit does not make strangers," Ayanna replied simply. "Only people who have not yet been properly introduced." As the Cherokee woman helped her gather her few belongings and assisted her onto one of their horses, Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. A loosening of the fear and despair that had been crushing her spirit since the morning's abandonment. She was still facing an uncertain future, still carrying a child without a husband or family to support her, but she was no longer alone. The prairie night closed around them as they rode toward the Cherokee village, and for the first time since the fire, Catherine allowed herself to hope that both she and her child might actually survive to see whatever tomorrow would bring. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Cherokee village appeared through the darkness like something from a dream Catherine never knew she could have. Flickering firelight danced between log cabins and traditional Cherokee dwellings, creating a warm glow that seemed to push back not just the prairie night, but the cold fear that had settled in her bones since morning. The sound of voices speaking in Cherokee mixed with the familiar frontier English she had grown up hearing, creating a linguistic tapestry that spoke of two worlds learning to coexist. Ayanna Nightbird guided her horse toward a substantial log cabin at the village's heart, its windows glowing with lamplight and its front porch occupied by several women who had clearly been waiting for their return. Word traveled fast in small communities, and Catherine realized that her arrival had been anticipated, discussed, and perhaps even debated before she had ridden into sight. "Grandmother Reed," Ayanna called out in English, addressing an elderly Cherokee woman whose silver hair was braided with ribbons and whose weathered hands spoke of decades spent in healing work. "We have brought a guest who has great need of our hospitality." The woman Ayanna had called Grandmother Reed stepped forward with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of medical situations. Her dark eyes took in Catherine's obvious pregnancy, her exhausted condition, and the few possessions that represented all she had left in the world. When she spoke, her English carried the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a second language, but mastered it completely. "Child, you look ready to fall from that horse. Come down carefully now, and let us see what kind of care you need." She turned to address the other women in Cherokee, and Catherine caught the urgent tone that suggested medical consultation rather than casual conversation. Sliding down from the horse proved more difficult than Catherine had anticipated. Her legs shook from exhaustion and the strain of riding side saddle while heavily pregnant, and she might have fallen if not for the steady hands of Thomas Nightbird, Ayana's older son, who caught her elbow with practiced ease. "Easy there, ma'am," he said in accented but clear English. "You've had enough troubles for one day without adding a tumble to the list." Thomas appeared to be in his early 20s, with the kind of quiet competence that suggested he had grown up assuming responsibility for others' welfare. His younger brother James, perhaps 17, took charge of the horses with the efficiency of someone raised around animals. Both young men had inherited their mother's intelligent eyes and her gift for reading situations quickly. Grandmother Reed's examination was gentle but thorough, conducted with the kind of professional detachment that put Catherine somewhat at ease despite the strangeness of her circumstances. The elderly Cherokee woman's hands were warm and sure as she felt Catherine's belly, checking the baby's position and listening with her ear pressed against the stretched fabric of Catherine's dress. "This child rides well," she announced after her examination. "Strong heartbeat, good position, but the mother needs food, rest, and peace of mind before this little one decides to make an appearance." She fixed Catherine with a steady gaze that seemed to see through polite pretenses to underlying truth. "How long since you last ate a proper meal?" Catherine had to think back through the chaos of the day before she could answer. "Yesterday evening, I think. There was some cornbread and salt pork, but with the fire and everything." She trailed off, realizing how long it had actually been since she had eaten anything substantial. Grandmother Reed made a sound that clearly indicated her opinion of pregnant women who failed to eat regularly, regardless of circumstances. "James," she called to Ayana's younger son, "go tell your Aunt Sarah that we need a bowl of that venison stew she was making, and some of her cornbread too. Tell her it's for a mother-to-be who hasn't been properly fed." The speed with which food appeared suggested a community accustomed to caring for unexpected guests. Within minutes, Catherine found herself seated on Grandmother Reed's front porch with a wooden bowl of the richest, most flavorful stew she had ever tasted. The venison was tender enough to cut with a spoon, swimming in a broth thick with wild onions, roots she didn't recognize, and herbs that made the entire dish taste like concentrated wilderness. "This is incredible," she managed between careful spoonfuls, conscious that her shrunken stomach needed to readjust gradually to solid food. "I've never tasted anything like it." Cherokee women have been perfecting that recipe for more generations than anyone can count, Ayana said, with evident pride. "My grandmother taught it to me, and her grandmother taught it to her. Some knowledge is too valuable to lose." As Catherine ate, a steady stream of village residents found reasons to walk past Grandmother Reed's cabin, each offering polite nods and curious glances at the pregnant white woman who had arrived so unexpectedly. She noticed that the community seemed to include both full-blood Cherokee families and others who appeared to be of mixed heritage, children with features that suggested Cherokee and European ancestry playing together without apparent distinction. "Your village is different from what I was told to expect," Catherine ventured carefully, not wanting to offend her hosts, but genuinely curious about what she was observing. Ayana's expression grew thoughtful. "What were you told to expect?" Wagon train leaders spoke of hostile Indians, of people who couldn't be trusted, who would steal from or harm white travelers. Catherine paused, conscious of how foolish those warnings sounded now. "But everyone here has shown me nothing but kindness. Fear makes people say many things that aren't true," Grandmother Reed observed, settling into a rocking chair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to evening conversations. "White people fear Indians because they don't understand. Our ways, Indians fear white people because we've learned that your promises aren't always kept. But fear is a poor teacher when it comes to understanding other people. The conversation that followed opened Catherine's eyes to complexities of frontier life that wagon train gossip had never mentioned. She learned that this Cherokee community had been established by families who had avoided the forced removal that had driven most Cherokee people to Indian Territory years earlier. They had survived by adapting, by learning to navigate between Cherokee traditions and the demands of an increasingly white-dominated territory. Many of the men worked as scouts for the territorial militia, using their knowledge of the land to help prevent conflicts between settlers and more hostile tribal groups. The women maintained traditional crafts and medical practices, while also adopting useful innovations from white culture. Children learned both Cherokee and English, both traditional stories and practical skills that would help them succeed in a changing world. We have learned, Ayana explained, that survival sometimes requires becoming something new while holding on to what matters most. Change is like a river. You can try to dam it up, but eventually it will find a way around your obstacles. Better to learn to swim in the current than to be swept away by fighting it. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself sharing her own story with remarkable openness. Perhaps it was the exhaustion or the relief of finding safety after such a terrifying day. But she told these strangers things she had barely admitted to herself: the shame of her first husband's family's rejection, the desperation that had led her into an unmarried relationship with Samuel Morrison, the growing certainty that she had been abandoned, not because of circumstances, but because of calculation. This Samuel Morrison, Grandmother Reed said when Catherine's story wound down. What kind of man leaves a pregnant woman to face a grass fire alone? The kind who was looking for an excuse to escape his promises, Catherine replied with bitter honesty. I think he saw the fire as an opportunity to solve a problem he didn't want to face. Then the fire did you a favor, Ayana said firmly. Better to learn a man's true nature before you bind your life to his than to discover it afterward when escape becomes impossible. The practical wisdom in that observation struck Catherine with surprising force. In all her hours of self-pity and fear since the abandonment, she hadn't considered the possibility that Samuel Morrison's betrayal might actually have saved her from a worse fate. A man who would abandon a pregnant woman in a crisis would surely find other ways to fail her in the years to come. But what am I going to do now? Catherine asked, voicing the question that had haunted her all day. A woman alone with a baby has few options in this territory. A woman alone has few options, Grandmother Reed corrected gently. But you are not alone anymore. You are here, with people who understand what it means to rebuild a life after everything familiar has been taken away. The elderly Cherokee woman's words carried weight that went beyond simple hospitality. Catherine sensed layers of meaning, references to experiences and losses that her hosts understood far better than she did. These were people who had faced their own abandonments, their own moments of standing alone in a hostile world with nothing but determination to sustain them. As the night deepened and the village settled into quiet, Ayana showed Catherine to a small room in her own cabin, a space that had clearly been prepared for a guest. The bed was simple but comfortable, made up with quilts that combined Cherokee patterns with familiar frontier designs. A wash basin and pitcher sat on a rough wooden table, and pegs on the wall offered places to hang her few belongings. This room was built for my mother when she became too old to live alone, Ayana explained, as she lit an oil lamp and adjusted the wick to provide gentle illumination. She walked the spirit trail 2 winters ago, but her presence still blesses this space. I think she would be pleased to know it shelters another woman in need. The simple kindness of that gesture, offering her a room that held such personal significance, nearly brought Catherine to tears again. I don't know how to thank you for all this. I have some money, not much, but I can pay. Money is useful for trading with white merchants, Ayana interrupted gently. But hospitality is not something Cherokee people sell. You are here because you need help, and we are able to provide it. When you are strong again, when your child is born and healthy, then we will talk about how you might contribute to our community. Until then, your job is to rest and let your baby grow strong. Left alone in the lamplit room, Catherine sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the extraordinary turn her life had taken in just one day. This morning she had awakened as part of a wagon train, engaged to be married, traveling toward what she had hoped would be a better life in Oregon Territory. Tonight she found herself a guest in a Cherokee village, surrounded by people whose existence she had barely acknowledged before today. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, perhaps sensing her emotional turmoil or simply responding to the day's stresses. Catherine placed both hands on her belly and spoke softly to the child who would soon make his or her appearance in this strange new world. Well, little one, this isn't exactly how I planned for you to be born, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. These people seem to understand something about family that goes beyond blood and marriage certificates. Maybe you'll grow up knowing things I never learned about what it means to belong somewhere. Through the thin cabin walls, she could hear the gentle sounds of a household settling in for the night. Ayanna moving quietly in the main room, the soft crackle of the fire being banked for the night, the distant call of an owl from the prairie. Beyond the village boundaries, it was peaceful in a way that the wagon train camp had never been, despite being surrounded by people she had just met. For the first time since the fire, Catherine allowed herself to believe that both she and her child might actually survive whatever challenges lay ahead. She wasn't naive enough to think that all her problems had been solved by one day of Cherokee hospitality, but she had been given something precious, time to rest, to heal, and to figure out what came next. As she prepared for sleep in her borrowed room, Catherine reflected on the day's lessons about assumptions and reality. The savage Indians she had been warned against had shown her more genuine kindness than the civilized white people who had claimed to care about her welfare. The abandonment that had seemed like the end of everything might actually be the beginning of something better. Outside her window, the prairie night stretched away toward horizons she couldn't see, full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make about her future and her child's. But tonight, for the first time in months, Catherine Walsh fell asleep, feeling safe and welcomed in a world that had seemed determined to reject her. Dawn in the Cherokee village came with sounds Catherine had never experienced before. The gentle rhythm of corn being ground in stone mortars, the soft conversations of women beginning their daily tasks, and the distinctive calls of prairie birds that seemed to serve as a natural alarm clock for the entire community. She awakened in the small room that had become her sanctuary, feeling more rested than she had in weeks, despite sleeping in an unfamiliar place. The baby was active this morning, stretching and turning in ways that made Catherine's ribs ache, but filled her with relief. After yesterday's trauma, she had worried that the stress might have harmed her unborn child. But the vigorous movements suggested that the little one was thriving despite the upheaval in their lives. A soft knock at her door interrupted her morning assessment. "Catherine?" Ayanna's voice was gentle but carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing household routines. "If you're feeling up to it, we have morning meal ready, and there are some things I'd like to show you today." Catherine dressed carefully in her one remaining dress, conscious that her appearance represented not just herself, but potentially all white people in the eyes of her Cherokee hosts. The dress was wrinkled and showed signs of yesterday's ordeal, but it was clean and modest. She wished she had her mother's cameo brooch or some other small ornament that might show respect for the occasion, but such luxuries had been lost in the wagon fire. The main room of Ayanna's cabin served multiple purposes: kitchen, dining area, and family gathering space. A large wooden table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs that showed the skilled craftsmanship Catherine was beginning to associate with Cherokee workmanship. The morning meal was already laid out, cornbread still warm from the oven, fried, salt pork, wild honey, and a drink that smelled of herbs and tasted like liquid sunshine. "What is this tea?" Catherine asked, savoring the complex flavors that seemed to energize her entire body. "A blend my grandmother taught me," Ayana replied, settling into her own chair with the easy grace of a woman comfortable in her own domain. "Sassafras root, wild mint, and a few other things that are good for women expecting babies. It will help settle your stomach and give you strength for the day ahead." Thomas and James Nightbird joined them for the meal, both young men displaying the kind of quiet courtesy that spoke of careful upbringing. They included Catherine in their conversation naturally, asking about her background and experiences without making her feel like a curiosity or burden. Their questions were intelligent and thoughtful, revealing educations that combined traditional Cherokee knowledge with broader understanding of the changing world around them. "Ma said you were traveling to Oregon Territory," Thomas observed, as he passed her the honey pot. "That's a long journey for anyone, but especially for a woman in your condition. What made you willing to risk such hardship?" Catherine considered how to answer honestly without revealing too much about her desperate circumstances. "My first husband died of cholera 2 years ago, and his family made it clear I wasn't welcome to stay in Ohio. Oregon seemed like a place where I could start fresh, maybe find work as a teacher or seamstress in one of the new towns. And this Samuel Morrison who abandoned you yesterday?" James asked with the directness of youth. What were his plans for Oregon? The question touched on the lies Catherine had been telling herself about Samuel's intentions and commitment. "He spoke of claiming land, starting a ranch. But I'm beginning to think he saw me more as free labor and other services than as a true partner in building a life together." Ayana nodded, with the understanding of someone who had observed many relationships built on uneven foundations. Men who make promises easily often break them just as easily. Cherokee custom requires a man to prove his commitment through actions. Over time, before marriage is considered, your white customs seem to allow promises without proof. After breakfast, Ayana led Catherine on what she called a learning walk through the village. The tour revealed the sophisticated organization of a community that had adapted Cherokee traditions to frontier realities while maintaining its essential character. Gardens showed the famous 3 sisters planting method, corn, beans, and squash growing together in harmony, alongside European vegetables that had proven useful in the harsh prairie environment. "Each plant helps the others," Ayana explained, as they paused beside a flourishing garden plot. "The corn provides a pole for the beans to climb. The beans add strength to the soil that feeds the corn and squash. The squash leaves shade the ground and keep weeds from stealing nutrients. This is how Cherokee people think about community. Everyone contributes something that helps everyone else." The lesson wasn't lost on Catherine, who was beginning to understand that her presence in the village would need to follow similar principles. She couldn't simply be a recipient of charity. She would need to find ways to contribute to the community's well-being if she wanted to earn a permanent place among these people. Their walk took them to the workshop of Mary Starr, a Cherokee woman in her 30s, who had mastered the art of combining traditional pottery techniques with forms that appealed to white traders. Her shelves were filled with beautiful vessels that showed Cherokee geometric patterns, but were shaped for practical frontier use. Water jugs, food storage containers, and cooking pots that were both functional and artistic. Mary's work sells well at the trading post in Fort Gibson, Ayana explained as the potter demonstrated her techniques. She has found a way to honor our traditions while meeting the needs of a changing world. Mary looked up from her wheel with clay-stained hands and a warm smile Are you the woman who was abandoned by the wagon train? The whole village has been talking about your arrival. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to be the subject of community gossip. I hope I haven't caused too much disruption. I never intended to become a burden on your people. Burden? Mary laughed, a sound like water bubbling over stones. Child, you've given our grandmothers something new to discuss besides who's courting whom and whose corn is growing tallest this year. Besides, we Cherokee understand something about being abandoned by people who promised to protect us. The reference carried weight that Catherine was only beginning to grasp. These Cherokee families had their own stories of betrayal and abandonment, experiences that made her personal crisis part of a larger pattern of broken promises and survival. Against overwhelming odds, their next stop was the cabin of William Ridge, a Cherokee man who served as both schoolteacher and record-keeper for the village. His home doubled as a schoolhouse where Cherokee children learned to read and write in both English and Cherokee, using a remarkable writing system that had been developed specifically for their language. Education is our secret weapon, William explained as he showed Catherine the Cherokee syllabary, a writing system that allowed Cherokee speakers to become literate in their own language with remarkable speed. The white authorities expect us to forget our culture as we learn English ways, but we can preserve Cherokee knowledge by writing it down, keeping our stories and wisdom alive for future generations. Catherine watched in fascination as children, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, read passages in Cherokee with the same fluency they displayed in English. The sophistication of the educational system challenged every assumption she had held about Cherokee intellectual capabilities. "This is extraordinary," she said, examining a child's tablet that showed exercises in both languages. "I had no idea such a writing system existed." "Most white people don't," William replied with gentle irony. "It's easier to think of us as primitive if you don't know about our books and newspapers and schools, but ignorance is a choice, not a necessity." The afternoon brought Catherine's introduction to Cherokee medical practices through observation of Grandmother Reed's work. The elderly woman maintained an extensive herb garden where dozens of different plants grew in carefully tended rows, each with specific healing properties that had been refined through generations of Cherokee medical knowledge. White medicine often tries to fight illness with harsh treatments that weaken the whole body, Grandmother Reed explained as she showed Catherine how to prepare various herbal remedies. Cherokee medicine seeks to strengthen the body's own ability to heal itself. We work with natural processes rather than against them. Catherine watched the preparation of medicines for everything from headaches to difficult childbirth, noting the precision and care that went into each remedy. The depth of knowledge required was impressive, understanding not just which plants to use, but when to harvest them, how to prepare them, and how to combine them for maximum effectiveness. For women expecting babies, Grandmother Reed continued, preparing a tea that smelled of earthy roots and sharp herbs, we have remedies that ease morning sickness, strengthen the womb, and make birth easier when the time comes. This knowledge has kept Cherokee mothers and babies healthy for more generations than anyone can count. As Catherine sipped the herbal tea, she felt a warmth spread through her body that seemed to reach directly to the baby growing inside her. The child responded with gentle movements that felt somehow calmer than the restless kicking of recent days. "I can feel the difference already," Catherine said with genuine amazement. "How did you learn all this?" "My grandmother began teaching me when I was younger than you are now," Grandmother Reed replied. "But learning never stops. Even now I discover new things about plants and healing. The natural world has more wisdom than any one person can master in a lifetime." The day's final lesson came during the evening meal, when the entire Nightbird family gathered around their table for a conversation that ranged from village politics to philosophical discussions about the nature of family and belonging. Catherine found herself contributing to discussions with increasing confidence, her opinions sought and valued despite her newcomer status. In Cherokee tradition, Ayana explained during a discussion about community obligations, family extends far beyond blood relationships. We have clan mothers who may not be biological relatives, but who carry responsibility for the welfare of everyone in their clan. We have adopted members who become as precious as those born to us. The statement hung in the air with implications that Catherine was afraid to examine too closely. Was Ayana suggesting that adoption into Cherokee family structures might be possible for her, or was she simply explaining cultural practices without personal application? Thomas Nightbird seemed to sense her uncertainty. "Ma doesn't say things like that without reason," he observed with a slight smile. "Cherokee women are practical people. When they start explaining adoption customs to someone, it usually means they're considering making those customs relevant." As the evening wound down and Catherine prepared for her second night in the village, she reflected on how much her understanding of the world had expanded in just 2 days. The Cherokee people she was coming to know bore no resemblance to the savage stereotypes that had shaped her expectations. Instead, she had discovered a sophisticated culture that had found ways to preserve its essential character while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. More personally, she was beginning to feel the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced since her first husband's death, a sense of belonging somewhere, of being valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. The Cherokee concept of extended family, based on choice and commitment rather than just blood relationships, offered possibilities she had never imagined. That night, as she settled into sleep in her borrowed room, Catherine placed both hands on her belly and spoke softly to her unborn child. "Little one, I think we may have found something better than what we lost. These people understand things about family and community that I'm just beginning to learn. Maybe you'll grow up knowing how to belong to something larger than yourself." The baby responded with a gentle flutter of movement that felt like agreement, or perhaps simply contentment. Outside her window, the sounds of the Cherokee village, settling into night, created a peaceful backdrop that was becoming familiar, even comforting. Catherine was beginning to understand that sometimes the best destinations were the ones you never knew you were looking for. Catherine's third week in the Cherokee village brought an unexpected summons that would change the course of her life forever. She had been working alongside Mary Starr in the pottery workshop, learning to shape clay with her hands, while her growing belly made the potter's wheel increasingly difficult to manage, when young James Nightbird appeared in the doorway, with unusual formality written across his features. "Catherine," he said, using the respectful tone reserved for serious matters, "the clan mothers have requested your presence at the council fire tonight. Ma says you should wear your best clothes and bring your mother's Bible." The request sent a flutter of nervousness through Catherine's chest that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. In her weeks among the Cherokee, she had observed the profound respect accorded to the clan mothers, elderly women who served as the spiritual and practical leaders of the community. These were not casual social gatherings, but formal proceedings that addressed matters of fundamental importance to tribal life. "Did she say what this is about?" Catherine asked, though she suspected James might not know the answer. "Something about adoption ceremonies and blood-sister rituals," James replied, his young face serious with the weight of information he didn't fully understand. "But Ma will explain everything when you get home." The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Ayana helped Catherine wash and braid her hair in a style that incorporated both Cherokee and frontier traditions, weaving small white feathers and blue beads through the auburn strands that caught the lamplight like captured sunshine. The ceremonial preparation felt both foreign and deeply meaningful, as though Catherine was being prepared for a transformation that went far beyond simple appearance. "The clan mothers have been watching you," Ayana explained as she worked on Catherine's hair with practiced fingers. "They see how you have adapted to our ways, how you treat our people with respect, how you contribute to our community's work. Most importantly, they see how you carry yourself with dignity despite the hardships that brought you to us." Catherine's one good dress had been cleaned and mended, its dark blue fabric appropriate for the solemnity of the occasion. Around her neck, she wore her mother's wedding ring on its chain, and in her hands she carried the leather-bound Bible that represented her connection to the world she had left behind. As evening approached, other women began arriving at the Nightbird cabin, not just Cherokee women, but several who appeared to be of mixed heritage, and even 2 white women who had married into the tribe. Catherine realized that this gathering represented something more complex than traditional Cherokee ceremony. It was an inclusive ritual that reflected the evolving nature of the community itself. Grandmother Reed arrived wearing regalia that spoke of her status as a senior clan mother, a dress of soft buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, a necklace of bear claws and turquoise, and a ceremonial headband adorned with eagle feathers that caught the firelight with every movement. Her presence transformed the gathering from a social event into something approaching the sacred. "Catherine Walsh," she said formally, her voice carrying the authority of generations, "you have lived among us for 3 weeks. You have shared our food, learned our ways, and shown respect for our traditions. The clan mothers have met in council, and we have decided to offer you something that is not given lightly." The elderly woman paused, studying Catherine's face, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "We offer you the opportunity to become Cherokee through bloodsister ceremony with Ayana Nightbird. This is not simply adoption, it is true kinship, with all the responsibilities and privileges that kinship brings." Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. In all her weeks of wondering about her future, she had never imagined such a possibility. The offer represented more than just acceptance into the community. It was an invitation to become part of something ancient and enduring. "I am deeply honored," Catherine managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "But I need to understand what this would mean. What would be expected of me? It means," Ayana stepped forward to explain, "that you would become my sister in the eyes of Cherokee law and tradition. Your child would be my child's cousin, raised with the same rights and responsibilities as any Cherokee child. You would have a voice in community decisions, a right to our protection, and an obligation to contribute to our welfare." Grandmother Reed nodded approvingly at Ayana's explanation. "It also means that you would be expected to learn Cherokee language, to understand our spiritual practices, and to pass Cherokee traditions onto your child. You would become a bridge between our world and the white world, helping both sides understand each other better." The weight of the offer was staggering. Catherine had come to the village as a refugee seeking temporary shelter, but she was being offered permanent belonging in a way that went deeper than legal documents or social conventions. This was kinship by choice and commitment, family created through mutual decision rather than accident of birth. "There is one more thing you must understand," Grandmother Reed continued, her expression growing even more serious. "Blood-sister ceremony creates bonds that cannot be broken. Once you become Ayana's sister, you become Cherokee. There is no going back to being only white. You will always be part of both worlds, but you will never again be only one or the other." Catherine looked around the circle of women who had gathered to witness this moment, seeing faces that reflected acceptance, curiosity, and genuine affection. These people had embraced her when she had nothing to offer but need. They had taught her skills, shared their knowledge, and now they were offering her something more precious than gold, a place to belong. "I accept," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any vow she had ever spoken. "I would be honored to become Ayana's blood sister." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. The women formed a circle around a small fire that had been built in a sacred pattern, its flames dancing in ways that seemed to respond to the ancient words being spoken in Cherokee. Grandmother Reed began with prayers that called upon the spirits of the four directions, the earth and sky, and the ancestors who watched over Cherokee people. Ayana stood beside Catherine as they both placed their hands on objects that represented their respective backgrounds, Catherine's mother's Bible and a Cherokee prayer pipe that had belonged to Ayana's grandmother. The symbolism was clear. They were bringing together two spiritual traditions in a union that honored both. "The Great Spirit recognizes no boundaries between peoples," Grandmother Reed intoned, her voice carrying the rhythms of ancient ceremony. "All human beings are children of the same earth, warmed by the same sun, blessed by the same rain. What we do tonight acknowledges what has always been true, that family is created by love and commitment, not by blood alone." The physical blood sharing was minimal, a small cut on each woman's wrist, their blood mingling in a bowl of sacred water that would be poured onto the earth as an offering. But the spiritual significance was profound. Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, as though her heart was expanding to make room for new connections, new loyalties, new understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere. "From this night forward," Grandmother Reed declared, Walsh is Catherine Nightbird, sister to Ayana, daughter to the Cherokee people. Her child will be born Cherokee, raised Cherokee, and will carry Cherokee blood through all generations to come. The name change surprised Catherine. She hadn't expected to take on Cherokee identity so completely. But as the women began singing traditional songs of welcome and celebration, she found herself deeply moved by the completeness of the acceptance being offered. She wasn't being asked to hide her white heritage or pretend to be something she wasn't. Instead, she was being invited to become something new, a person who could authentically claim belonging in both worlds. As the ceremony concluded, each woman in the circle came forward to embrace Catherine and speak words of welcome in Cherokee. Though she couldn't understand most of what was said, the warmth and sincerity of the greetings transcended language barriers. She was being welcomed not just as a guest or friend, but as family. The celebration that followed the formal ceremony was joyous and inclusive, with food appearing as if by magic and music that blended Cherokee songs with familiar frontier melodies. Catherine found herself the center of attention in ways that felt overwhelming but deeply affirming. Children who had been politely curious about her presence now approached with the familiarity reserved for family members, asking questions about her baby and offering to teach her Cherokee games. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Thomas and James Nightbird approached her with formal courtesy that masked obvious emotion. "Sister Catherine," Thomas said, using her new title with careful precision, "James and I want you to know that we consider it an honor to have you as part of our family. Your child will have older brothers who will teach him to ride and hunt, or teach her to weave and gather medicines, depending on what interests the little one most." The offer of brotherhood from these young men, given so naturally and generously, brought tears to Catherine's eyes. She had entered the village as a woman without family, without prospects, without hope. Now she found herself part of an extended family network that would provide support and guidance for both her and her child. As the evening wound down and the other women began departing for their own homes, Ayana drew Catherine aside for a private conversation that would define their new relationship. "Sister," she said, the word carrying both formality and deep affection, There are practical matters we need to discuss. Your baby will be born Cherokee, but there are traditions and responsibilities that come with Cherokee identity. They talked long into the night about the obligations and privileges that Catherine had accepted. She would need to learn Cherokee language fluently, not just enough for basic communication. She would need to understand Cherokee spiritual practices, though. She wouldn't be required to abandon her Christian faith. Most importantly, she would need to serve as a cultural bridge, helping other whites understand Cherokee people while helping Cherokee families navigate the increasing complexities of territorial life. The white world and Cherokee world are going to continue bumping up against each other, Ayanna explained as they sat by the dying fire. People like you, people who truly belong to both, will be essential for preventing misunderstandings that could lead to bloodshed. The responsibility was daunting, but Catherine found herself energized rather than overwhelmed by the challenge. For the first time since her first husband's death, she had a clear sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. She had been given not just a family, but a role to play in the larger story of two cultures learning to coexist. That night, as she settled into sleep in what was now truly her home, Catherine placed both hands on her belly and spoke to her unborn child with new confidence. Little one, you're going to be born into something special. You'll be Cherokee and white, Christian and traditional, a bridge between worlds. It's a big responsibility, but you'll have a whole family to help you carry it. The baby responded, with vigorous movement that seemed to express approval, or perhaps simply excitement about the adventures ahead. Outside her window, the sounds of the Cherokee village at night had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The call of owls, the distant sound of someone playing a flute, the gentle murmur of conversations in Cherokee drifting from other cabins. Catherine, Nightbird, closed her eyes and smiled, understanding for the first time in her life what it meant to truly belong somewhere. The bloodsister ceremony had given her more than just a new name and new family. It had given her a new identity that honored both her past and her future, creating possibilities she had never imagined when she stood alone beside the smoking ruins of her wagon just 3 weeks ago. The labor pains began on a Tuesday morning, in late May, just as Catherine was helping Ayanna tend to their shared vegetable garden. The first contraction caught her completely off guard, a sharp tightening across her belly that made her gasp and drop the basket of green beans she had been collecting. For a moment, she stood frozen among the neat rows of corn and squash, one hand pressed to her lower back, trying to convince herself that this was just another false alarm. "Sister!" Ayanna's voice carried immediate concern as she straightened from weeding the bean plants. Her experienced eyes took in Catherine's posture, the way she was breathing, the expression of startled recognition crossing her face. "Is it time?" Catherine managed a nod just as the second contraction hit, stronger than the first and impossible to ignore. "I think so. They're different from the practice pains I've been having. These feel serious." Within minutes, the Cherokee village's well-practiced system for managing childbirth swung into action. James Nightbird was dispatched to fetch Grandmother Reed and her birthing supplies, while Thomas rode to collect Sarah Thornton, a white woman who had married into the tribe and served as an additional midwife for difficult births. Mary Starr appeared with armloads of clean linens and the special herbal preparations that Cherokee women had used for generations to ease labor and prevent complications. The transformation of the Nightbird cabin into a birthing sanctuary was remarkable to witness. Within an hour, Catherine's small room had been rearranged to create the optimal environment for Cherokee childbirth traditions. Sacred objects were placed at the 4 cardinal directions, healing herbs were burning in a small clay bowl, and the walls were adorned with protective symbols that Grandmother Reed painted with careful precision. Cherokee babies are born into ceremony, Grandmother Reed explained, as she prepared her instruments with the same methodical care that Catherine had observed in all her medical work. From the moment labor begins until the child takes their first breath, we surround mother and baby with prayers and protection. The labor progressed steadily through the morning and into the afternoon, with Catherine supported by a circle of Cherokee women who took turns massaging her back, offering sips of herbal tea, and providing the kind of calm encouragement that helped her focus through each wave of pain. The experience was profoundly different from what she had expected, based on stories from white women about the dangers and terrors of childbirth. Pain is the price we pay for bringing new life into the world, Sarah Thornton murmured during one particularly intense contraction. But pain with purpose is different from pain without meaning. Your body knows what to do, Catherine. Trust the wisdom that women have carried for thousands of years. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine found herself drawing strength, not just from the herbal remedies and skilled midwifery, but from the sense of being held by an entire community. Outside her room, she could hear the voices of children playing, women going about their daily tasks, men discussing village business. Life continued around her labor, but she felt supported by the knowledge that everyone in the village was aware of what was happening and ready to help if needed. The Cherokee approach to childbirth included the baby's father in ways that Catherine hadn't anticipated, despite the fact that Samuel Morrison was long gone and thoroughly forgotten. Thomas and James Nightbird took turns sitting outside her, and Dorr maintaining what they called brother watch, a tradition that ensured someone who cared about the mother was always present to run errands, fetch supplies, or simply provide moral support through their presence. In Cherokee custom, Ayana explained during a brief lull between contractions, a child belongs to the mother's clan, but the entire extended family shares responsibility for raising them. Your baby will have uncles who teach important skills, aunts who pass on women's wisdom, and grandmothers who tell the old stories. The thought of her child growing up surrounded by such extensive family support filled Catherine with determination to endure whatever challenges lay ahead. This baby would never experience the kind of abandonment and rejection that had marked her own life. Instead, they would grow up knowing exactly where they belonged and who they could count on for help. As evening approached, the labor intensified, to the point where Catherine could no longer maintain conversation between contractions. Grandmother Reed's experienced hands guided her through the final stages of birth with a combination of practical skill and spiritual ceremony that made the entire experience feel sacred rather than simply medical. "I can see the baby's head," Grandmother Reed announced as the sun was setting outside the cabin windows. "This little one is eager to meet their Cherokee family. One more big push, Catherine. Bring your child into the world." The final contraction seemed to last forever, a wave of pressure and effort that demanded everything Catherine had left to give. And then, suddenly, the pressure released and she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Her baby's first cry, strong and clear and full of righteous indignation at being forced from the warm darkness into the bright, cold world. "A daughter," Grandmother Reed announced with satisfaction, lifting the squirming infant for Catherine to see. "A beautiful, healthy daughter who clearly has her mother's strong spirit." The baby was perfect. Tiny fingers that gripped Catherine's thumb with surprising strength, dark hair that was already showing hints of curl, and eyes that seemed to focus on her mother's face with remarkable alertness for such a new arrival. Catherine felt her heart expand to accommodate love so intense it was almost painful, a fierce protectiveness that made her understand why mothers throughout history had been willing to die for their children. "What will you name her?" Ayana asked as she helped Catherine settle the baby at her breast for the first time. Catherine had been considering names for months, But now that she could see her daughter's face, only one name felt right. Hope, she said quietly, Hope Nightbird, because she represents everything good that can come from the worst circumstances. The naming ceremony that followed was simple but profound. Grandmother Reed spoke prayers in Cherokee that called upon the spirits to protect and guide the new child, while each woman present offered gifts that would help Hope grow into a strong Cherokee woman. Mary Starr brought a tiny pair of moccasins decorated with beadwork. Sarah Thornton offered a silver bracelet that had belonged to her own daughter. Ayana presented a small dream catcher that would hang over Hope's cradle to filter out bad dreams and allow only good ones to reach her sleep. But the most meaningful gift came from an unexpected source. As the women were finishing their celebration, Thomas Nightbird knocked softly on the door and asked permission to see his new niece. When Catherine agreed, he entered carrying a small wooden cradle that he had obviously spent weeks carving and finishing. "I started working on this the day after you became our sister," he explained shyly, running his fingers over the smooth wood that showed intricate Cherokee patterns. "Every Cherokee baby needs a proper cradle, and I wanted Hope to have something made especially for her by her Cherokee family." The cradle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved from what looked like cherry wood and polished to a warm glow. The headboard featured traditional Cherokee symbols for protection and prosperity, while the sides showed delicate patterns that seemed to flow like water or wind. It was clearly the work of someone who had inherited both skill and artistic vision from generations of Cherokee woodworkers. "Thomas, this is beautiful," Catherine said, tears starting to flow again as she realized the hours of love and care that had gone into creating such a gift. "Hope will treasure this her entire life." As the celebration wound down and the other women began returning to their own homes, Catherine found herself alone with her daughter for the first time. Hope had fallen asleep at her breast, tiny fist curled against Catherine's chest, breathing with the perfect rhythm of healthy new life. The enormity of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She had brought a child into the world, not just any child, but a Cherokee child who would grow up as a full member of this remarkable community. Hope would learn both English and Cherokee, both Christian prayers and traditional ceremonies, both frontier survival skills and ancient wisdom about living in harmony with the natural world. But even as Catherine marveled at the possibilities opening before her daughter, she was aware that challenges lay ahead that would test everything they had built together. The Cherokee village existed in an increasingly complicated relationship with the white territorial government, and a mixed-race child would face questions of identity and belonging that even Catherine's own experience couldn't fully prepare. However, these concerns were given immediate relevance by the arrival, 3 days after Hope's birth, of an unexpected visitor who would force both Catherine and the Cherokee community to confront the realities of their position in a changing world. Captain Robert Henderson of the Territorial Militia rode into the village with a small escort, ostensibly on a routine patrol, but clearly seeking something more specific than general reconnaissance. His arrival sent ripples of tension through the community, as Cherokee families had learned to be wary of unannounced military visits that often preceded demands for compliance with new governmental regulations. Catherine, still recovering from childbirth but determined to protect her new family, watched from her window as Captain Henderson dismounted and approached Ayana's cabin with the purposeful stride of someone carrying official business. The conversation that followed, conducted in the formal English reserved for dealings with territorial authorities, would determine whether the peaceful coexistence they had built could survive contact with the broader political forces shaping the Missouri Territory. "Mrs. Nightbird," Captain Henderson began, using Catherine's new name with careful pronunciation that suggested he had done his research, I understand you were recently adopted into this Cherokee community after being abandoned by a wagon train. That's correct, Catherine replied, stepping onto the porch, with Hope sleeping in her arms and Ayanna standing protectively beside her. I was given shelter and family when I had neither. I'm sure you're grateful for their kindness, the captain continued, his tone suggesting that gratitude should have its limits. But there are questions being raised about white women living among Indians, especially when children are involved. Some people wonder whether such arrangements serve the best interests of territorial development. The implications of his statement hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, carrying the potential for destruction that could sweep away everything Catherine had found among the Cherokee people. She realized that her daughter's birth had not just brought new joy into their lives, but new vulnerabilities that would require all her courage and cunning to navigate successfully. Captain Henderson's words settled over the village like a gathering storm, and Catherine could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere as Cherokee families began moving closer to the central area where this crucial conversation was taking place. Children were quietly called inside, while men positioned themselves where they could observe without appearing threatening. The community had clearly experienced such confrontations before, and knew that words spoken here could determine their future safety. "Captain Henderson," Catherine replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority she had learned from watching Grandmother Reed handle difficult situations. "I'm curious about exactly what concerns the territorial government might have about a woman finding family among people who saved her life." The captain's expression tightened slightly, suggesting he hadn't expected to be questioned so directly. "Ma'am, there are reports that Cherokee communities are harboring white settlers who should be contributing to territorial development rather than adopting Indian ways." He gestured around the village with barely concealed disapproval. "Some folks wonder if women like yourself might be providing information about territorial activities to people who aren't necessarily loyal to American interests." The accusation of potential treason hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Catherine felt Ayanna tense beside her. This was clearly more serious than a routine patrol or casual inquiry. Someone with political influence had sent Captain Henderson here with specific instructions to assess the loyalty of white residents in Cherokee communities. "I see," Catherine said carefully, shifting Hope to a more comfortable position while maintaining eye contact with the captain. "And who exactly has expressed these concerns? I'd be curious to know what evidence they have for such serious accusations." James Nightbird chose that moment to emerge from the family cabin, his young face serious, but his posture deliberately non-threatening. He carried a leather satchel that Catherine recognized as containing official territorial documents, land, grants, trade permits, and other paperwork that established the Cherokee village's legal status within the territorial system. "Captain," James said respectfully, "perhaps you'd like to review our territorial registration documents. We've been in full compliance with all governmental requirements since this community was established 5 years ago." The offer of documentation clearly wasn't what Captain Henderson had expected. He accepted the papers with obvious reluctance, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable as he reviewed certificates that proved the Cherokee community's legal standing and cooperative relationship with territorial authorities. "These appear to be in order," he admitted grudgingly, "but that doesn't address concerns about cultural assimilation and divided loyalties." It was Grandmother Reed who stepped forward to address this deeper challenge, her presence commanding immediate respect even from hostile visitors. The elderly Cherokee woman had donned her formal regalia for this confrontation, and her appearance reminded everyone present that they were dealing with a sovereign people rather than subjects to be managed at will. "Captain Henderson," she said, In English that carried no trace of accent or uncertainty, perhaps you could explain to me exactly what you mean by divided loyalties. This community has never acted against territorial interests. We have provided scouts for your military patrols, sold surplus crops to territorial settlements, and maintained peaceful relations with all our neighbors. What specific disloyalty are you investigating? The direct challenge forced Captain Henderson to reveal more about his true mission than he had probably intended. There are concerns in Jefferson City that Cherokee communities might be providing sanctuary for people fleeing legal obligations, debtors, deserters, folks avoiding territorial taxes. And there are questions about whether adopted whites might be passing along information about military movements or territorial plans. Catherine felt a flash of understanding about what was really happening. This wasn't about her specifically, but about a broader governmental nervousness regarding autonomous communities that operated somewhat outside direct territorial control. The Cherokee village's success in maintaining both traditional culture and cooperative relationships with white neighbors made it a model that some officials found threatening rather than encouraging. "Captain," she said, making a decision that would define her role in this community for years to come, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what's happening here. Would you be willing to accept an invitation to observe our community activities for a few days? I believe seeing our daily life might address your concerns more effectively than any amount of discussion." The offer clearly surprised both the captain and the Cherokee residents. Inviting territorial authority figures to spend extended time in the village was unprecedented and potentially dangerous. But Catherine had observed enough of Cherokee diplomacy to understand that sometimes the best defense was complete transparency. Ayanna caught Catherine's eye with a look that asked if she was certain about this course of action. Catherine's slight nod conveyed her conviction that openness might be their best strategy for maintaining the autonomy they had worked so hard to build. "You're inviting me to quarter troops in your village?" Captain Henderson asked suspiciously. "I'm inviting you personally to accept Cherokee hospitality while observing how we live," Catherine clarified. "Your men are welcome to make camp nearby, but I'm suggesting that you might gain better understanding by experiencing our community as a guest rather than as an investigator." The proposal put Captain Henderson in an awkward position. Refusing might suggest that he wasn't actually interested in gathering accurate information, while accepting meant placing himself in a vulnerable position among people he had been sent to investigate. After a long moment of consideration, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Mrs. Nightbird, I'll accept your invitation for 3 days. But I want to be clear that this is an official assessment of community activities and loyalties." The 3 days that followed proved to be an education for everyone involved. Captain Henderson arrived each morning expecting to uncover evidence of suspicious activities or anti-territorial sentiment. Instead, he found himself witnessing the daily operations of a remarkably well-organized community that had successfully blended Cherokee traditions with practical frontier living. He observed William Ridge's school, where Cherokee children learned to read and write in both English and Cherokee while studying territorial history and American civics alongside traditional tribal knowledge. He watched Mary Starr create pottery that combined Cherokee artistic traditions with forms that appealed to territorial markets, generating income that supported not just her family, but the entire community. Most impressively, he witnessed the Cherokee men's roles as territorial scouts and peacekeepers, using their knowledge of local geography and tribal politics to prevent conflicts that could have erupted into costly military interventions. Their intelligence about hostile raiding parties and their diplomatic connections with other tribal groups had prevented numerous incidents that would have required expensive military responses. I have to admit, Captain Henderson said, on his second evening sharing a meal at Grandmother Reed's table. "This isn't what I expected to find. The reports I received suggested a community that was essentially hostile to territorial interests." "And what reports were those?" Grandmother Reed asked pointedly. "Because I'd be very interested to know who has been providing your superiors with inaccurate information about our activities." The captain's discomfort suggested that he was beginning to suspect he had been sent on this mission based on deliberately misleading intelligence. There have been complaints from some white settlers about Cherokee communities receiving preferential treatment from territorial authorities, claims that you're not paying appropriate taxes or contributing to territorial defense. Thomas Nightbird produced a ledger that documented the community's financial contributions to territorial operations, taxes paid, goods sold to military commissaries, services provided to territorial survey teams. The careful record-keeping revealed a community that was actually contributing more per capita to territorial development than many white settlements. "It appears," Captain Henderson observed dryly, "that someone has been providing my superiors with information that doesn't match reality." Catherine had been waiting for exactly this opening. "Captain, may I ask who specifically has been raising these concerns about Cherokee communities? Because it seems to me that someone with political influence has been deliberately spreading false information about people who pose no threat to territorial interests." The conversation that followed revealed the political machinations behind the captain's investigation. A group of white land speculators, led by a territorial legislator named Marcus Sullivan, no relation to Catherine despite the shared surname, had been lobbying for policies that would force Cherokee communities to either relocate or surrender their communal landholdings to individual white ownership. They've been arguing that Cherokee communities represent obstacles to territorial development, Captain Henderson explained, his tone suggesting growing disgust with the assignment he had been given. "But after spending time here, I can see that this community is actually contributing to territorial stability and prosperity." The revelation that political rather than security concerns had motivated the investigation changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Catherine realized that they were dealing not with legitimate governmental oversight, but with a coordinated attempt to undermine Cherokee autonomy for the benefit of private interests. "What will you report back to your superiors?" Ayana asked. Directly. Captain Henderson was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options and their consequences. "I'll report exactly what I've observed. A law-abiding community that contributes positively to territorial development and poses no security threat to American interests. I'll also note that the concerns raised about this community appear to have been based on inaccurate or deliberately misleading information." His answer represented a victory, but Catherine understood that it was only a temporary one. Marcus Sullivan and his associates wouldn't be deterred by a single unfavorable military report. They would continue looking for ways to pressure Cherokee communities, and they would eventually find officials more sympathetic to their agenda. On Captain Henderson's final evening in the village, he approached Catherine privately for a conversation that would prove crucial to her understanding of the larger forces at work in territorial politics. "Mrs. Nightbird," he said, using her Cherokee name with obvious respect, "I want you to understand that while my report will be favorable, this isn't the end of the matter. There are powerful people who want Cherokee lands opened for white settlement, and they're not going to give up just because one military investigation didn't support their claims." He handed her a document that made her blood run cold, a proposed territorial ordinance that would require all persons of mixed loyalty to register with territorial authorities and submit to regular governmental oversight. The language was carefully crafted to target exactly people like her, without explicitly mentioning race or tribal affiliation. This legislation is being pushed through the Territorial Assembly as we speak, Captain Henderson explained. If it passes, people like you could be forced to choose between Cherokee identity and American citizenship. And communities like this one could be subject to federal oversight that would effectively end their autonomy. Catherine stared at the document, understanding that the peaceful existence they had built was under threat from forces much larger and more determined than she had realized. The birth of her daughter had brought not just joy, but a new urgency to the political challenges facing Cherokee communities throughout the territory. As Captain Henderson prepared to depart the next morning, he offered one final piece of advice that would shape Catherine's actions in the months to come. If you want to protect what you've built here, you're going to need allies in territorial government who understand the value of what Cherokee communities contribute. And you're going to need those allies soon. The captain's departure left the village in a state of tense uncertainty. They had successfully navigated one challenge, but larger threats were gathering on the horizon. Catherine looked down at baby Hope, sleeping peacefully in her Cherokee cradle, and made a silent promise that her daughter would grow up in a world where Cherokee and white people could coexist with mutual respect. But achieving that goal would require courage, political skill, and alliances that hadn't yet been built. The letter that arrived 6 weeks after Captain Henderson's departure changed everything Catherine thought she knew about territorial politics. Delivered by a traveling merchant who seemed nervous about carrying correspondence to a Cherokee village, the envelope bore the official seal of the Missouri Territorial Legislature and was addressed specifically to Mrs. Catherine Nightbird. Cherokee Adoption Registry. Catherine broke the wax seal with trembling fingers while Ayanna and Grandmother Reed watched anxiously from across the kitchen table. Baby Hope slept peacefully in her cradle nearby, unaware that her future might be determined by whatever message lay folded inside the formal government stationery. "It's from Representative Jonathan Mitchell," Catherine announced, scanning the carefully written text with growing amazement. "He's requesting a meeting to discuss Cherokee community contributions to territorial development. He says he's been reviewing Captain Henderson's report and wants to explore opportunities for formal recognition of our cooperative achievements." The letter's tone was respectful rather than threatening, but its implications were staggering. A territorial legislator was initiating contact with a Cherokee community not to investigate problems, but to discuss potential political partnerships. Such communication was unprecedented in Catherine's experience and represented either a remarkable opportunity or an elaborate trap. "I know this name," Grandmother Reed said thoughtfully. "Jonathan Mitchell has spoken in the legislature against forced Indian removal policies. His father was a missionary who worked with Cherokee people in Georgia before the Great Displacement, but that doesn't mean we can trust his motives completely." Ayanna studied the letter with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read between the lines of official communications. "He suggests meeting at the territorial capital rather than here in the village. That could be good. It treats us as political equals rather than subjects to be managed. But it also means traveling into territory where we have no control over circumstances." The decision to accept Representative Mitchell's invitation required extensive consultation with the village council, a formal body that included both Cherokee traditionalists and younger community members who had experience navigating territorial politics. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions about the wisdom of engaging directly with territorial authorities versus maintaining the protective isolation that had served them well thus far. "Every time our people have trusted white politicians," argued Robert Thornton, Sarah's Cherokee husband, who had witnessed multiple betrayals of tribal agreements. "We have ended up losing more than we gained. Why should this time be different?" But William Ridge, the school teacher whose education included both Cherokee traditions and American political theory, offered a different perspective. "The world is changing around us whether we participate in that change or not. If we don't have voices in territorial government, decisions will be made about us without us. At least if we engage politically, we have some chance to influence outcomes." Catherine found herself in the unexpected position of being asked to represent not just her own interests, but those of the entire Cherokee community in potential negotiations with territorial authorities. The responsibility was both honor and burden, carrying the weight of decisions that could affect generations of Cherokee families. "I'm willing to go," she said finally, "but not alone. If Representative Mitchell wants to discuss Cherokee contributions to territorial development, he should hear from Cherokee voices, not just from a white woman who has been adopted into the tribe." The delegation they assembled was carefully chosen to represent different aspects of Cherokee community life while also demonstrating their sophistication and political awareness. Thomas Nightbird would accompany Catherine as both family representative and demonstration of Cherokee educational achievements. His fluency in English, Cherokee and Spanish, combined with his knowledge of territorial law, would counter any assumptions about Cherokee intellectual capabilities. William Ridge would join them as an advocate for Cherokee educational innovations, carrying examples of the bilingual curriculum that had proven so successful in preparing Cherokee children for life in an increasingly complex world. Most importantly, they would be accompanied by David Ross, a Cherokee man in his 40s who had served as a territorial scout and maintained connections throughout the political establishment. The journey to Jefferson City took 4 days by horseback, traveling through territory that was increasingly dominated by white settlements, but still retained pockets of Cherokee influence. Catherine carried hope in a traditional Cherokee cradleboard that allowed her to nurse and care for the baby while traveling, drawing curious stares from white settlers who weren't accustomed to seeing such demonstrations of successful intercultural adaptation. Their arrival in the territorial capital created a minor sensation, as word spread quickly through political circles that a Cherokee delegation had come to meet with Representative Mitchell. The hotel clerk who registered their party seemed genuinely uncertain about appropriate protocols for hosting Cherokee guests, eventually settling on treating them with the same courtesy he would extend to any other territorial visitors. Representative Mitchell proved to be a man in his early 50s whose weathered features and calloused hands suggested more familiarity with frontier life than most politicians possessed. His office was lined with books in multiple languages, including what appeared to be Cherokee texts, and decorated with artifacts that spoke of genuine respect for indigenous cultures rather than mere curiosity. "Mrs. Nightbird," he said, rising, to greet their delegation with obvious sincerity, "thank you for accepting my invitation, and please introduce me to your companions. I want to ensure that I understand the full scope of Cherokee community achievements." The formal introductions that followed established the tone for negotiations that would prove more complex and promising than anyone had anticipated. Representative Mitchell had clearly done extensive research into Cherokee history, culture, and contemporary political situations. His questions demonstrated genuine interest in understanding how Cherokee communities had managed to maintain traditional values while adapting to territorial requirements. "Captain Henderson's report was remarkable," Mitchell explained, as they settled around a conference table that had obviously been arranged specifically for this meeting. He documented levels of community organization, educational achievement, and economic contribution that exceed those of most white settlements. But what struck me most was his observation that Cherokee communities seem to have solved problems that white settlements are still struggling with. Thomas Nightbird leaned forward with interest. What kinds of problems, Representative? Sustainable agriculture, in challenging environments, education that produces both practical skills and cultural literacy, conflict resolution that prevents rather than simply punishes antisocial behavior. Your communities have achieved social stability that frankly makes many white settlements look chaotic by comparison. The conversation that followed revealed Representative Mitchell's broader political vision, which went far beyond simply protecting Cherokee rights to encompass territorial development strategies that could benefit everyone involved. He had been researching successful models of intercultural cooperation from other parts of the country and believed that Missouri Territory could become a national example of how different peoples could coexist productively. The legislation that Marcus Sullivan and his associates are pushing would be catastrophic, not just for Cherokee communities, but for territorial development generally, Mitchell explained, referring to the anti-Cherokee ordinances that Captain Henderson had warned them about. Forcing productive communities to relocate or abandon their cultural practices would eliminate exactly the innovations that could help Missouri Territory succeed. William Ridge pulled out carefully prepared documents that demonstrated the educational achievements of Cherokee schools, including literacy rates that exceeded those of many white communities and bilingual capabilities that made Cherokee graduates valuable as interpreters, traders, and diplomatic intermediaries. Our educational approach produces citizens who can contribute to territorial development while maintaining connections to traditional knowledge that has practical value, William explained. Cherokee agricultural techniques, medicinal practices, and environmental management methods could benefit white settlements if there were formal mechanisms for sharing such knowledge. Representative Mitchell studied the educational materials with obvious fascination. This is exactly what I've been hoping to find, concrete examples of how Cherokee knowledge can contribute to territorial prosperity. Would your communities be willing to participate in formal knowledge-sharing programs with white settlements? The question opened up possibilities that none of them had considered before. Instead of simply defending Cherokee autonomy, they were being invited to actively participate in territorial development as equal partners, rather than subjects to be managed or obstacles to be removed. David Ross, whose experience as a territorial scout had given him extensive knowledge of intercultural tensions throughout the region, offered a crucial perspective on the practical challenges such cooperation would face. Representative Mitchell, the biggest obstacle to successful cooperation isn't cultural differences, it's economic competition. Marcus Sullivan and his associates want Cherokee lands not because they object to our culture, but because they want to profit from forced sales of our property. Any cooperation program would need to address those economic pressures. Mitchell nodded grimly. That's exactly why I need Cherokee allies in territorial politics. Sullivan's group has significant influence because they represent concentrated economic interests. But if Cherokee communities can demonstrate that cooperation produces better results than confiscation, we might be able to build sufficient political support to defeat their legislation. The alliance that emerged from their negotiations was more comprehensive than Catherine had dared to hope. Representative Mitchell would sponsor legislation formally recognizing Cherokee communities as autonomous cultural zones with special status under territorial law. In exchange, Cherokee communities would participate in pilot programs that shared traditional knowledge with white settlements while maintaining their own cultural integrity. Most importantly, Cherokee representatives would be granted formal advisory roles in territorial government, creating mechanisms for indigenous voices to influence policies that affected their communities. It was unprecedented recognition that went far beyond simply protecting Cherokee rights to actively incorporating Cherokee perspectives into territorial governance. As the negotiations concluded and they prepared for the journey home, Catherine reflected on how dramatically her role had evolved since that night when she had stood alone beside her burning wagon. The pregnant widow, who had been abandoned by her own people, had become a bridge between worlds, helping to create political structures that could benefit both Cherokee and white communities. But even as she celebrated this diplomatic breakthrough, Catherine was aware that their success had made them targets for even more determined opposition. Marcus Sullivan and his associates wouldn't be deterred by a single legislative defeat, and they had resources and connections that could pose serious threats to everything they had built. The letter that awaited them upon their return to the village confirmed her fears. Written in crude block letters and delivered anonymously, its message was brief and unmistakable. Indian lovers and their half-breed children aren't welcome in civilized territory. Leave now or face consequences. Catherine looked down at Hope, now 3 months old and thriving in her Cherokee cradle, and felt her determination harden into something approaching steel. The political alliances they had built represented hope for a better future, but protecting that future would require courage that went beyond diplomatic negotiations. Some battles would have to be fought with more than words and good intentions. The morning that changed everything began like any other autumn day in the Cherokee village, with the crisp air carrying the scent of wood smoke and the sound of children, practicing their English lessons under William Ridge's patient instruction. Catherine was nursing 6-month-old Hope in the early sunlight when the first rider appeared on the horizon, followed quickly by 3 more, all moving at the urgent pace that meant either emergency or trouble. The lead rider was Benjamin Torres, a mixed-blood Cherokee who worked as a courier between various tribal communities and territorial settlements. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cool morning air, and his face carried the grim expression of someone bearing news that no one wanted to hear. "Catherine," he called out as he dismounted near the Nightbird cabin, "I need to speak with you and the council immediately. There's been an incident at Standing Rock Village, and it concerns the new legislation Representative Mitchell was supposed to be protecting us from." Within an hour, the village council had assembled in Grandmother Reed's cabin, its largest room barely adequate for the crowd of concerned Cherokee families who insisted on hearing whatever news Torres had brought. Catherine found herself sitting at the head of the table, Hope sleeping in her arms, while community leaders waited for information that might determine their collective future. 3 days ago, Torres began without preamble, territorial marshals raided Standing Rock Village. They claimed to be investigating reports of illegal weapons trading, but what they really did was confiscate property, arrest 2 family heads on trumped-up charges, and deliver ultimatums about compliance with new territorial ordinances. The room erupted in angry murmurs as the implications became clear. Standing Rock Village was only 60 miles north of their own community, and it had maintained the same cooperative relationship with territorial authorities that had made their own negotiations with Representative Mitchell possible. If Standing Rock could be attacked without justification, no Cherokee community was safe. "What new ordinances?" Ayanna asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Torres pulled out a crumpled paper that had obviously been hastily copied from official documents. The Anti-Sedition and Territorial Security Act, passed by emergency legislative session, while most representatives were out of the capital. It authorizes territorial marshals to investigate any community suspected of harboring foreign influences or maintaining divided loyalties to American territorial interests. Catherine felt her blood turn cold as she recognized the language. From the proposed legislation, Captain Henderson had warned her about months earlier. Despite Representative Mitchell's promises and their successful negotiations, Marcus Sullivan and his associates had found a way to push through their anti-Cherokee agenda using fear-based appeals to territorial security. The law is specifically written to target Cherokee communities, Torres continued, his voice heavy with bitter understanding. It defines foreign influence to include traditional tribal governance, divided loyalty to include cultural practices that differ from standard, territorial customs, and security threats to include any community that operates with significant autonomy from direct territorial oversight. Grandmother Reed's weathered hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the legal assault became apparent. They have created laws that make Cherokee identity itself a crime, she said quietly. This is not about security or loyalty. This is about stealing our lands and destroying our people through legal rather than military means. The discussion that followed was unlike any Catherine had witnessed in her months among the Cherokee. The usual careful deliberation and consensus building gave way to heated arguments about how to respond to what amounted to a declaration of war against Cherokee autonomy. Some voices called for immediate resistance, others for strategic retreat, still others for attempting to work within the new legal framework. "We could try to appeal through Representative Mitchell," suggested David Ross, though his tone indicated little confidence in that approach. He might be able to challenge the law in territorial courts or find procedural grounds for overturning it. "And while we're waiting for legal challenges that may never succeed," Robert Thornton replied with controlled anger, "how many more Cherokee communities will be destroyed? How many more families will be scattered or imprisoned on false charges?" It was Thomas Nightbird who articulated the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice directly. "Sister Catherine," he said, turning to her with obvious reluctance, "this law specifically targets people like you, whites who have adopted Cherokee identity. You and Hope are probably in the most immediate danger because you represent exactly what these laws are designed to prevent." The observation hit Catherine like a physical blow, not because she hadn't considered the personal danger, but because it forced her to confront the possibility that her presence in the community might actually be increasing the risk to everyone she had come to love. If territorial marshals were looking for evidence of foreign influence and divided loyalty, a white woman with a mixed-race child living as a Cherokee would provide exactly the kind of inflammatory example they needed to justify broader persecution. "Maybe," Catherine said slowly, the words painful to speak, "I should take Hope and leave the village. If my presence here is what they're really targeting, removing that justification might protect the rest of the community." The immediate and unanimous rejection of that suggestion surprised her with its intensity. Ayanna spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of blood sisterhood that made contradiction impossible. "You are Cherokee now, sister. Cherokee people. Do not abandon each other when threats appear. If they want to destroy our community, they will have to destroy all of us together." Grandmother Reed nodded emphatically. "That child in your arms is Cherokee, born Cherokee, and will remain Cherokee regardless of what laws white politicians pass. We have protected Cherokee children through removal, through war, through disease, and through every other disaster that has been thrown at us. We will protect this child too." The determination in their voices gave Catherine strength, but it also clarified the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't just about protecting individual families or even a single community. The new, territorial laws represented a systematic attempt to eliminate Cherokee cultural autonomy throughout Missouri Territory, and resistance would require coordination and resources that went far beyond what any single village could provide. It was William Ridge, who proposed the solution that would define their strategy for the months ahead. "We need to do what Cherokee people have always done when faced with threats too large for individual communities to handle," he said with quiet conviction. "We need to call for a gathering of all Cherokee leaders in the territory. If they want to destroy us one village at a time, we need to stand together and force them to face all of us at once." The proposal to organize a territorial Cherokee council was both necessary and incredibly dangerous. Such gatherings had been specifically prohibited under the new Anti-Sedition Act, and anyone participating could be arrested for conspiracy against territorial security. But the alternative, allowing Cherokee communities to be picked off individually, was clearly worse than the risks of coordinated resistance. Over the following week, runners were sent to Cherokee villages throughout Missouri Territory, carrying carefully coded messages that invited leaders to a harvest celebration at a location that would be disclosed only to those who confirmed their participation. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with every contacted community agreeing to send representatives despite the obvious dangers involved. The gathering that resulted was the largest assembly of Cherokee leaders in Missouri Territory since the forced removals of the 1830s. Meeting in a hidden valley that provided natural protection from territorial patrols, more than 60 Cherokee men and women came together to coordinate their response to the legal assault on their communities. Catherine attended as both a Cherokee community representative and someone whose unique position as an adopted white woman gave her insights into territorial politics that full-blood Cherokee leaders might lack. Hope traveled with her in the traditional cradleboard, becoming perhaps the youngest participant in a political gathering of such historical significance. The debates that took place over 3 days of intensive discussion revealed the full scope of Cherokee resistance capabilities that had been carefully hidden from territorial authorities. Communities that appeared to be isolated and vulnerable actually maintained extensive communication networks, shared resources for mutual defense, and preserved traditional governance structures that could coordinate large-scale resistance if necessary. Most importantly, the gathering revealed that Cherokee communities had been far more successful in adapting to territorial conditions than their oppressors realized. Cherokee men served as scouts, interpreters, and guides throughout the territorial military system, giving them access to information about governmental plans and troop movements. Cherokee women maintained trade relationships that generated significant economic leverage with white businesses that depended on indigenous knowledge and labor. "We are not as powerless as Marcus Sullivan and his associates believe," declared Morning Star, a Cherokee woman whose community near the Arkansas border had successfully resisted 3 previous attempts at forced relocation. "They see us as obstacles to be removed, but we are actually essential to territorial prosperity in ways they don't understand. If we coordinate our resistance properly, we can make them realize that destroying Cherokee communities would damage their own interests." The strategy that emerged from the gathering was more sophisticated than simple resistance or accommodation. Cherokee communities would use their embedded positions within territorial systems to gather intelligence about planned raids and legal challenges. They would coordinate economic pressure by withdrawing labor and trade relationships from businesses that supported anti-Cherokee legislation. Most importantly, they would document every instance of illegal or excessive governmental action, building legal cases that could be pursued through federal courts that might be more sympathetic than territorial authorities. Catherine found herself appointed to lead the intelligence gathering network, using her political connections with Representative Mitchell and other sympathetic territorial officials to monitor legislative developments and governmental planning. It was a role that would require her to travel frequently between Cherokee communities and territorial centers, often carrying information that could mean the difference between survival and destruction for entire families. As the gathering concluded, and representatives prepared to return to their communities, Catherine stood with hope in her arms, looking out over an assembly that represented the determination of a people who refused to disappear quietly into the margins of history. The pregnant widow, who had been abandoned beside a burning wagon 8 months earlier, had become a key figure in a resistance movement that would determine the future of Cherokee people throughout Missouri Territory. But even as she felt pride in how far they had all come, Catherine was aware that their success in organizing resistance had probably marked them for even more determined governmental persecution. Marcus Sullivan and his associates would not tolerate coordinated Cherokee opposition to their plans, and the next phase of their campaign would likely involve violence that went far beyond legal intimidation. The storm that had been gathering since her first night in the Cherokee village was about to break with a fury that would test everything they had built together. But for the first time since this conflict had begun, Catherine felt confident that they had the strength and unity necessary to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. Cherokee people had endured far worse than territorial politicians, and they would endure this too. The confrontation that would define Catherine's legacy came on a frost-covered morning in November, exactly 1 year after Hope's birth. She was teaching her daughter to sit up in the carved cradle that Thomas had made when the sound of approaching horses echoed across the village. Not the familiar rhythm of Cherokee riders, but the organized cadence of territorial cavalry moving. In formation, Marshal Edwin Crawford led a force of 20 mounted men, their official authority backed by the new Anti-Sedition Act and their personal motivations fueled by Marcus Sullivan's promises of land grants for anyone who helped break Cherokee resistance. Catherine watched from her window as the marshal, dismounted with the calculated swagger of someone who believed he held all the power in this encounter. By order of the Missouri Territorial Authority, Crawford announced in a voice loud enough to carry throughout the village, this community is under investigation for seditious activities and violations of territorial security laws. All residents are required to present themselves for questioning and property inspection. The Cherokee families who emerged from their homes moved with the dignified composure of people who had faced such challenges before, but Catherine could see the tension in their shoulders, the way children stayed close to their mothers, the careful positioning of men who were ready to protect their families if negotiation failed. Ayanna appeared at Catherine's side, her face set in the expression of controlled determination that had become familiar during community crises. "Sister," she said quietly, "they've come for you and Hope specifically. This isn't about the whole village. It's about breaking our resistance by targeting the person who has become our political voice." Catherine looked down at Hope, now walking with determined steps between furniture pieces and babbling in a mixture of Cherokee and English that would have been considered evidence of foreign influence under the new laws. Her daughter's innocent laughter seemed to mock the fear and hatred that had brought armed men to their peaceful community. "Then I won't let them use us as an excuse to destroy everything we've built," Catherine said, settling Hope in her cradleboard and stepping onto the porch to face Marshal Crawford directly. "Marshal," she called out, her voice carrying the authority she had learned from watching Cherokee leaders handle hostile officials, "I understand you're here to investigate our community. I'm Catherine Nightbird, and I'm prepared to answer any questions you might have about our activities." Crawford's eyes narrowed as he studied the woman who had become the focus of territorial concerns about Cherokee resistance. Catherine had learned to dress for such encounters, traditional Cherokee clothing that established her cultural identity, but with additions like her mother's Bible and wedding ring that complicated simple categorizations of loyalty or belonging. "Mrs. Nightbird," Crawford said, deliberately emphasizing her Cherokee name with contempt. You're under arrest for violation of territorial security laws, specifically for participating in unauthorized political gatherings and inciting resistance to lawful governmental authority. The charges were serious enough to carry prison sentences that would separate Catherine from Hope indefinitely. But she had prepared for this possibility during months of intelligence gathering and resistance. Coordination, Marshal Crawford, she replied calmly. I assume you have warrants for these arrests, and I'd like to know specifically what evidence you have for these accusations. The Marshal's hesitation suggested that his legal authority might not be as comprehensive as his initial announcement had implied. The Anti-Sedition Act required specific evidence of illegal activities, not just guilt by association or cultural identity. Catherine's request for documentation forced him to reveal whether this was a legitimate legal action or simple intimidation. I have authority to investigate suspected seditious activities, Crawford replied, though his tone had lost some of its earlier confidence. And I have reports that this community has been harboring fugitives and planning resistance to territorial law. It was Grandmother Reed who stepped forward to challenge the Marshal's accusations with the kind of legal precision that Cherokee leaders had learned through decades of fighting governmental overreach. Marshal Crawford, she said in English that carried no trace of accent or uncertainty, if you have specific charges against specific individuals, please present your warrants. If you're conducting a general investigation, please explain the legal basis for that investigation and the scope of your authority. The elderly Cherokee woman's command of legal terminology clearly surprised Crawford, who had probably expected to intimidate a community of people he assumed were ignorant of their rights under territorial law. Her questions forced him to admit that his authority was more limited than his initial presentation had suggested. We have reports from reliable sources, Crawford said defensively, about illegal gatherings and anti-governmental activities. That gives us sufficient cause for investigation. Catherine saw the opening that Grandmother Reed had created. Marshal, I'd be very interested to know who these reliable sources are, since I believe they may have provided you with deliberately false information. Would you be willing to identify your informants so we can address any misunderstandings directly? The question put Crawford in an impossible position. His reliable sources were almost certainly Marcus Sullivan and his associates, whose motivations were economic rather than legal. Admitting that his investigation was based on information from people who would profit from Cherokee displacement would undermine his authority completely. Before Crawford could respond, the sound of additional horses approaching from the south drew everyone's attention. Representative Jonathan Mitchell rode into the village with a small escort, his presence transforming the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The territorial legislator's arrival represented legitimate governmental authority that outranked a territorial marshal's investigative powers. Marshal Crawford, Mitchell said as he dismounted with deliberate calm, I need to speak with you about the scope and authorization of your current investigation. The private conversation that followed between Mitchell and Crawford was conducted in voices too low for observers to hear, but the Marshal's increasingly uncomfortable body language suggested that his legal position was being systematically dismantled. When the two men rejoined the larger group, Crawford's demeanor had changed from aggressive authority to defensive uncertainty. Representative Mitchell has clarified certain aspects of territorial law that affect this investigation, Crawford announced reluctantly. It appears that some of the activities I was sent to investigate may not actually violate current territorial statutes. Mitchell stepped forward to address the assembled Cherokee families with the respect that had characterized his previous dealings with their community. I want to apologize for this disruption to your community, he said formally. There have been some misunderstandings about territorial security laws and their application to Cherokee communities that maintain cooperative relationships with territorial authorities. The apology was more than diplomatic courtesy. It was public acknowledgement that the raid had been based on false premises and exceeded legitimate governmental authority. But Catherine understood that this victory was temporary, dependent on Mitchell's continued political influence and the Cherokee community's ability to maintain their careful balance between autonomy and cooperation. As Crawford and his men prepared to depart, clearly disappointed at their failure to find evidence supporting their preconceptions, Catherine made a decision that would define her role in Cherokee territorial relations for years to come. She approached the marshal with hope in her arms, her daughter's presence a living symbol of the intercultural cooperation that men like Crawford saw as threatening. "Marshal Crawford," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want you to understand something about what you've seen here today. This community represents the future of Missouri Territory, people from different backgrounds working together to build something better than what existed before. You can choose to see that as a threat, or you can choose to see it as an opportunity." She paused, looking around at the Cherokee families who had become her family, the community that had transformed her from a desperate refugee into someone with purpose and belonging. "I was abandoned by my own people when I needed help most. These Cherokee families took me in, gave me a home, and made my daughter a part of their community. If that's what you call sedition, then I'm proud to be seditious." The declaration was both challenge and invitation, offering Crawford and the territorial authorities he represented a choice between continued conflict and genuine cooperation. Catherine's words carried the weight of lived experience, demonstrating that Cherokee communities offered something valuable that could benefit everyone involved. As the territorial forces finally departed, leaving the village in peace, but not in security, Catherine reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by that moment of opening her door to unexpected need. The pregnant widow, who had lost everything in a wagon fire, had become a bridge between worlds, helping to create possibilities for cooperation that neither Cherokee nor white communities had imagined possible. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand the stories of her unusual childhood, Catherine would tell her daughter about the night that changed everything, the moment when compassion triumphed over fear, when a Cherokee medicine woman chose to see need rather than difference, when blood-sister bonds proved stronger than the artificial divisions that humans create between themselves. Hope Nightbird grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in Cherokee longhouses and territorial courtrooms, serving as a translator and mediator who helped expand the cooperation model that her mother and Cherokee family had pioneered. She became living proof that identity could be chosen and created, rather than simply inherited, that belonging was a matter of commitment rather than blood. The Cherokee village that had saved Catherine from abandonment became a model for intercultural cooperation that influenced territorial policy throughout the Missouri region and beyond. The innovations they developed in education, agriculture, and community governance were studied and replicated in other territories facing similar challenges of cultural diversity and economic development. Catherine Nightbird's legacy was not just personal survival, but the creation of possibilities for cooperation that transcended the fears and prejudices of her time. She had learned that family was something you built through love and commitment, that home was wherever people chose to accept you completely, and that the most powerful response to hatred was the persistent practice of understanding. The blood-sister ceremony that had made her Cherokee was just the beginning of a transformation that would influence generations of people who believed that different didn't have to mean enemy. that cooperation was possible even between groups with every reason to distrust each other, and that sometimes the most important changes in the world began with one person's decision to open their door to someone in need. In the end, Catherine's story became part of Cherokee oral tradition, told around fires on winter nights as an example of how the Cherokee people had always survived, by adapting without surrendering their essential identity, by finding strength in unity while respecting individual differences, and by choosing hope over fear, even when the future seemed uncertain. The pregnant widow who had been abandoned in a prairie fire had become a grandmother whose descendants carried both Cherokee and European heritage with equal pride, living proof that America's future lay not in the dominance of one culture over others, but in the creation of new possibilities that honored the best of all traditions while building something unprecedented and beautiful from their combination. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.